The late 1960s and early 1970s represented the most dangerous, unstable phase of the Cold War. It was the age of proxies, conflicts fought in the shadows of the developing world, where the Soviet Union and the United States poured resources and personnel into battles they officially denied owning. This demand for absolute deniability created a need for soldiers who could be deployed and sacrificed without triggering a global crisis. The system designed to manage this need was known internally as the Zero Footprint Protocol, and it started not with a military mobilization, but with a silent, bureaucratic summons. The target was always the same: highly specialized, low-profile military operators, men who were elite in skill but expendable in documentation. Their selection was a clandestine process managed by a joint task force of military intelligence and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. The initiation of a mission was always marked by the same ritualistic, unsettling breach of standard military procedure. The message arrived without a signature. It was usually delivered by a lone motorcycle courier, a man in a plain gray suit who never looked the recipient in the eye and disappeared immediately. The message itself was often printed on thermographic paper, designed to self-destruct after 3 hours. No seal, no department header, no traceable origin. Just a single, clinical sentence, terrifying in its stark finality. Report to Terminal 6. Bring nothing. The phrase, "bring nothing," was the first step in their operational erasure. It meant no personal effects, no religious medallions, no family photographs, and certainly no standard-issue equipment that could be traced back to a specific unit or base. The men who received it weren't regular soldiers. They were the ones pulled from lists that don't officially exist, operators drawn from the deepest wells of special operations, demolition, and signals intelligence. They were men used only when governments need results without consequences, when the political cost of admitting involvement was greater than the human cost of the mission. That night, they were flown via unmarked military transport, a blacked-out C-130 or sometimes a repurposed civilian jet, to a facility so remote it wasn't on any public chart, and at that time, wasn't on satellite maps yet. These sites, often located in the vast deserts of Nevada or the remote islands of the Pacific, were known simply as Forward Processing Sites, FPS, designed to transition the soldiers from citizens into ghosts. Inside the sterile, windowless briefing room, the atmosphere was oppressive. There were no flags and no insignia on the walls. The only identifying figure was a single, high-ranking officer, a general or a colonel with no identifying name tag, whose face was often masked by the dim lighting. This officer was the last official link the soldiers would have to their old lives. He told them, "You will deploy under no flag. You will return under none." This was the core directive of Project Orion, the internal code for the Deniable Soldier Program, the contract of absolute expendability. The soldiers' commitment was not to the mission, but to the denial of the mission. They didn't know it then, but those were the last words anyone would officially speak to them under the umbrella of protection provided by the government. The briefing officer was their executioner, severing the bond between the warrior and the state. The operational briefing was unnervingly brief, delivered with the cold detachment of an engineer describing a hydraulic system. The mission details were never written down, only displayed on a screen for minutes, then instantly purged from the computer server. Their assignment was labeled simply, Advance Recon, Zone K-47. Zone K-47 was a strategically vital, yet internationally disputed strip of land in Southeast Asia, a region that all major governments publicly denied having troops in. It was the quintessential proxy battleground, a place where communist and Western-backed forces clashed daily, providing the perfect cover for deniable intervention. The objective sounded simple, the kind of boilerplate mission given to any reconnaissance unit: infiltrate, verify the presence of new Soviet-supplied hardware, and extract. But everything about the operation felt fundamentally wrong, a violation of every principle of special operations they had ever learned. This wasn't a mission with risk, it was a mission with built-in abandonment. No extraction timetable. Unlike standard operations, there was no planned recovery window. The extraction was conditional, not guaranteed, dependent entirely on external factors, not their success. No backup team. The principle of immediate, overlapping support, fundamental to high-risk missions, was abandoned. They were deployed entirely alone. Their survival hinged on their own resources and evasion skills. No satellite coverage. They were told that overhead surveillance would be redirected to unrelated activities during the crucial phase of their operation. This was the ultimate chilling reality. No orbital eyes would witness their insertion or their plight. The chilling rule, the final rule, delivered by the communications officer, sealed their isolation. All communication beyond Phase 1 will be blocked. You will have no direct tactical support frequency. They were elite operators. They had to ask why this fundamental breach of protocol was necessary. The response was delivered by the general, his voice echoing in the silent bunker, defining the true, horrifying stakes of the mission. If you're heard, we're at war. If you're seen, we're lying. The mission's success, therefore, was entirely dependent on their absolute silence and eventual, traceless disappearance. They were sent not as soldiers to fight, but as human tripwires, to be used for intelligence, and then, to be dissolved into the local landscape. They realized that their primary fight was not against the enemy closing in, but against the possibility of their own survival compromising the elaborate, fragile lie of their government. That night, they understood that the only way to return successfully was to never be remembered. The final moments before insertion were a blur of adrenaline and practiced precision. The men of Project Orion, the deniable team, had spent the final hours of the flight in a state of controlled tension, their internal clocks synchronized, their gear checked and double-checked. They were deploying into the heart of Zone K-47, a strip of jungle and highland where the Cold War was fought with machetes, Soviet-supplied Alaska 47s, and absolute ideological conviction. The team was composed of 3 men, the perfect deniable size: Vance, the team leader, whose calm was unnerving; Reyes, the communications specialist, the critical link to the world they were leaving; and Sergeant Major K, the expert in weapons and demolitions, a man whose silence was his greatest weapon. The final descent was made via halo, high altitude, low opening parachute jump, a high-risk maneuver executed at extreme altitude to avoid radar detection. The air was thin, cold, and silent. The team crossed the border and hit the ground in the dense jungle foliage at precisely 2:17 local time. The first 90 minutes were spent on critical ingress procedures, retrieving and burying the parachutes, setting up the basic communication sweep, and establishing a secure perimeter. Everything was routine, familiar, and silent. But by 03:40, the first, chilling signs of the Delta Protocol activation began to manifest, not as enemy action, but as institutional failure. The operators, relying on their sophisticated, classified equipment, began to realize they were not merely isolated, they were being intentionally blinded. The GPS units displayed blank coordinates. The screens that should have shown precise longitude and latitude, derived from classified military satellites, were completely empty. The units had not failed. They were receiving no signal. The system had been deliberately shut off to them. The encrypted radio responded with a looping tone, the high-pitched, insistent electronic whine that the men instantly recognized. It was the code used only when a specific, dedicated frequency was deliberately shut down from the transmission source, indicating the channel was no longer recognized as secure or operational. They tried a second channel, the backup, short burst, emergency frequency, used only for immediate casualty reports. Silence. Not static, but an utterly dead airwave, as if the frequency had been vacuumed clean of all electronic life. A third channel, the dedicated, encrypted data link for continuous mission updates and weather reports. Silence. The 3 men huddled together, their faces lit only by the faint, green glow of the useless radio dials. The atmosphere had shifted from tactical tension to profound, existential dread. They understood the physics of failure. They were now confronting the politics of erasure. Then, at 04:12, Captain Vance made the final attempt. He prepared the burst transmitter for the mission's single, ultimate emergency check-in sequence. This sequence, the Sentinel Protocol, was designed to pierce through layers of jamming and encryption, signaling immediate, strategic crisis. The message was sent in a coded, 3-second burst. Command, this is Sentinel. Check-in request. Half a second later, a message returned. It was a synthesized, technical signal, generated automatically by the receiving base station software, the ultimate confirmation of denial. Invalid call sign. Vance and Reyes looked at each other, the green light reflecting the horror in their eyes. Their call sign wasn't invalid. Sentinel was the code name that had been tattooed onto their souls. Their existence had just been deleted. The moment they had crossed the border, the bureaucracy had anticipated the political risk, judged it unacceptable, and preemptively executed the final, silent kill switch. They were now operating under the iron rule of the Delta Protocol. They were assets that never existed, in a country they never entered, fighting a war that was never declared. Thousands of miles away, in a soundproof, windowless conference room deep inside the Pentagon, a meeting took place behind a locked door. This was the chamber of the Denial and Deception (D&D) Executive Committee, the ultimate arbiters of the Shadow War. There were no uniforms, only civilian suits, and the atmosphere was one of quiet, intellectual ruthlessness. The issue on the table was Zone K-47. The committee was running a geopolitical simulation in real time, fueled by the data that had just been received from the aborted extraction attempt, the original helicopter pilot's warning, and the frantic, but silent, electronic efforts of the Sentinel team to regain contact. A small technical team projected the data onto a wall. Satellite images showing a rapid concentration of Soviet-aligned local forces near the team's last known ingress point, intercepted transmissions confirming high-level communication between Moscow and the local regime, and a grim-faced analyst detailing the political risks if the mission was exposed. The conversation was devoid of emotion. They spoke only in terms of calculus, risk versus reward, exposure versus denial. The men on the ground were simply variables in a larger, global equation. The risk was that if the Sentinel team was captured, the evidence of American boots on the ground in Zone K-47 would instantly provide the Soviet Union with irrefutable proof of U.S. military aggression, potentially triggering a catastrophic escalation. After barely 20 minutes of clinical discussion, the senior-most representative of the State Department leaned forward and said the sentence that sealed the soldiers' fate, a sentence that history would never record, but that echoed forever in the deep archives of memory. If they are discovered, we cannot acknowledge them. Recommend closure. The word, closure, was the ultimate euphemism. It was the bureaucratic term for operational death. And that was it. Closure. Not rescue. Not support. Not extraction. Just removal. The systematic, complete purging of 3 living men from the historical and logistical record of the United States. The operational execution. The purge. The command was carried out with chilling speed by the technical staff waiting outside the locked door. The team's operational identity was immediately incinerated. Their unit page was wiped from all active intelligence databases. All entries under Project Orion relating to Sentinel were replaced with simple, uninformative error codes. Their files were sealed in deep, non-digitized vaults under the highest level of national security classification, effectively removing them from any potential future audit or inquiry. Their families received form letters, generated automatically by the D&D's internal communications system, confirming the finality of their separation. Your son has been reassigned to a permanent, non-disclosable capacity. Status: non-disclosable. All further inquiries will be handled by the Defense Legal Affairs Office. The circular, unyielding language was designed to paralyze grief with bureaucracy. It eliminated hope without confirming death, replacing the soldier with a perpetual question mark. They were gone, not because they died on the battlefield, but because the men in the locked room decided that their continued existence, even if silent, was a political liability the nation could not afford. The absolute silence that followed the invalid call sign reply was the definitive beginning of the end. Vance, Reyes, and Kay were no longer soldiers on a mission. They were stateless survivalists, assets irrevocably written off by the very machine that deployed them. The theoretical threat of the Delta Protocol had become the harsh reality of their existence. Stranded, surrounded by hostile forces and now comprehensively erased by their own command, the team faced a paradox: they had to survive without ever being found. They fought for weeks, not against a defined objective, but against the sheer, grinding reality of abandonment. Their training, which had cost millions of dollars and countless hours, was now applied solely to the grim task of self-preservation. They survived on captured supplies. This meant risky, nighttime raids on isolated enemy outposts or scavenging from local villages, acts that carried the constant threat of exposure. They became masters of the tactical scrounge, utilizing the very environment they were sent to observe to sustain their lives. They moved only at night. They became nocturnal, their daylight hours spent hidden deep within dense triple canopy jungle, sweating out the heat and the constant fear of discovery. Their days were spent reviewing the failure, their nights spent executing their desperate evasion. They buried their tracks in riverbeds and abandoned mines. They employed sophisticated evasion techniques designed to mislead trackers, moving over rock, through water, and utilizing the region's complex network of forgotten tunnels and caves. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and designed to eliminate the physical evidence of their passage. They were always expecting reinforcements that were never coming. Even the hardened professionals could not completely shed the deep-seated belief in the military bond. Every hour they monitored their dead radio channels, holding on to the faint, irrational hope that the orders would be reversed, the mistake corrected, and the extraction team would arrive. The psychological attrition was brutal. The men were fighting an internal battle against institutional betrayal as much as an external one against the enemy patrols. One soldier, Reyes, the intelligence specialist, the man who understood the mechanisms of communication and denial best, finally understood the cold, political logic of their predicament. Reyes spoke the truth with a voice devoid of emotion, stripped bare of loyalty. This wasn't an oversight. They can't bring us home. If we return, everything collapses. The realization was a turning point. It was the final, definitive loss of hope, replaced by a clear-eyed understanding of the political calculus. Because the mission they carried out, the verification of the new Soviet missile battery locations and the extent of the Soviet-aligned regime's logistical support, proved things their government publicly denied. They held the irrefutable evidence of a massive violation of an internationally recognized treaty zone. Things that could immediately spark an international crisis, or a full-scale war. They were no longer soldiers, they were highly sensitive, self-aware pieces of classified evidence. Their survival was a threat to global stability, and their mission was now, simply, to vanish. The men knew their fate was sealed, but the ingrained need to communicate the truth, to leave a final record of their betrayal, remained. They spent weeks rigging their final, most desperate project, adapting their sophisticated burst transmitter to send a signal through the last viable, albeit unsanctioned, communications route. This was a frequency known to be monitored by a distant Allied listening post, a facility in a neutral country that might record the message without automatically triggering the Delta Protocol's jamming response. The transmission had to be slow, human, and devastatingly honest. It was not a call for rescue, it was a statement to history. 3 months after insertion, long after the Pentagon had purged their records and declared the Sentinel project permanently closed, a weak signal reached that Allied listening post. It was distorted, barely audible, swimming in a sea of static and long-distance noise, but it was human. The voice was tired, flat, and absolute, the voice of a man who knew he was already dead. If anyone hears this, we request only that someone tells our families we tried. We didn't disappear. We were disappeared. The distinction was critical. Disappeared meant they were lost to the enemy. Disappeared meant they were actively erased by their friends. The technicians at the listening post were startled. They recognized the modulation technique. It was military, classified, but deeply unsanctioned. They immediately flagged the event. No reply was sent. Protocol forbade it. The mere act of acknowledging the transmission, of sending a signal back onto that frequency, would have confirmed the existence of the abandoned expedition personnel, violating the non-intervention treaty and the core directive of the D&D Executive Committee. The tape recording of the transmission was immediately sealed and designated Priority 0, access denied. And after that, the transmission stopped. The fuel cells on the improvised transmitter likely failed. The men were never recovered. Their records were never reinstated. Their names were never spoken in official halls, only whispered in the darkest recesses of the intelligence community. They remained the ultimate sacrifice to the Shadow War. Decades passed. The Cold War ended. The geopolitical risks that justified the Delta Protocol evaporated. As governments changed and classification mandates expired, the administrative structures that executed the cover-up began to decay. Years later, declassified files revealed fragments. These were not smoking guns, but historical whispers, the bureaucratic evidence of institutional guilt. One document, released in a massive, unedited block of Vietnam-era intelligence, contained a simple map. It was labeled K-47 with "No recovery," stamped across it in bold, red ink. The stamp indicated a deliberate, irreversible command decision, not a failure to find, but a refusal to retrieve. Another file, detailing budget overruns for a joint intelligence project, contained a financial report noting the existence of abandoned personnel still active, in the Zone K-47 area for a period of 18 months after the official closure date. This was proof that headquarters knew some of the ghosts were still alive and fighting. The most damning revelation came from a personnel document discussing the D&D Executive Committee's procedures. It contained a section discussing asset risk assessment, with the vast majority of the text redacted, leaving only one visible, unedited line. They cannot return. But the world never learned the full truth. The public narrative remained unchallenged. Accidental loss during an unrelated humanitarian support flight. Because to tell the full, unvarnished story would mean admitting the existence of a mission that violated treaties, borders, and every principle the government claimed to defend. It would expose the ruthless internal mechanism that valued political stability over the lives of its most elite fighting men. The government chose the lie, and the lie preserved the secrecy. So the soldiers stayed where they died, in silence, in shadows, in a war that wasn't supposed to exist, and that they were never allowed to come home from. They became the invisible cost of the Cold War, the men whose final, lasting service was their eternal, unacknowledged absence. The Shadow War did not end with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it simply retreated deeper into the bureaucracy. For the men of Project Orion, the soldiers of the Sentinel team and all those before and after them who vanished under the Delta Protocol, the end of the Cold War brought no reprieve. Their non-existence was the foundation of a greater political narrative, and that narrative, once established, proved impossibly resilient. Yet, history is a relentless excavator. The lie, however meticulously constructed by the Denial and Deception (D&D) Executive Committee, was fundamentally dependent on keeping documents and memory sealed. As the strictures of national security were gradually loosened in the 1990s and early 2000s, and as the decades-old classification mandates expired, the administrative structures that executed the cover-up began to decay. The paper trail, the very thing the military establishment relied upon, began to leak the truth in fragmented, agonizing slow motion. Years later, declassified files revealed fragments. These were not smoking guns found in enemy bunkers, but whispers found in dusty archival boxes. The fragments emerged not as a sudden revelation, but as anomalous data points in thousands of pages of mundane military finance and logistics reports. Only analysts deeply familiar with the classified architecture of the Shadow Wars could recognize the signs of institutional guilt. The map of refusal, the first tangible evidence of the irreversible command decision, came from a massive block of documents related to high-altitude reconnaissance flights over Southeast Asia. Tucked into an inventory list for aerial photograph analysis was a single, disturbing artifact. It was a simple, gridded tactical map labeled K-47, the precise location of the Sentinel team's mission and the zone where the final transmission had been cut off. The map itself was unremarkable, detailing terrain features and potential landing zones, but across the critical insertion area, covering the entire operational rectangle, was a handwritten notation in heavy, dark ink, later verified to be the script of a high-ranking member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "No recovery," stamped across it. This single, brutal phrase, "no recovery," was the absolute confirmation. It did not mean, extraction failed. It meant, extraction forbidden. It indicated a deliberate, irreversible command decision made at the highest level. The men were alive, but the cost of retrieving them was deemed strategically unviable. The stamp was the final official order that sealed their fate, condemning them to the shadow. Further evidence surfaced in a financial audit detailing budget expenditures for a specific joint intelligence project active during the same era. The audit, intended to track funds related to high-risk communications gear, contained an alarming anomaly. The budget showed continuous, low-level funding for satellite communications equipment servicing the Zone K-47 area for a period of 18 months after the Sentinel team had been declared administratively closed. Attached to the report was a cryptic, supporting note, a low classification filing mistake, a report noting, abandoned personnel still active, in the region. This was the most concrete proof that the D&D Executive Committee and the highest echelons of command knew that some of their ghosts were still alive, fighting their desperate, isolated war for survival. The funding was not for rescue, it was a contingency, likely intended to monitor their movements or, if necessary, ensure their permanent, quiet disappearance should they threaten to return. The soldiers, fighting for their lives, were being tracked by the very government that denied their existence. The final, blacked-out truth. The most damning fragment, the whisper that most deeply penetrated the institutional lie, was found in a personnel document discussing the D&D Executive Committee's operational procedures. The multi-page memo detailed the legal and political thresholds for activating the Delta Protocol. The vast majority of the text was heavily and permanently redacted, blacked out to protect the names of the decision-makers and the precise details of the compromised treaties. Yet, due to a printing error or a lapse in the censorial process, one single, unredacted line was left exposed in the center of the page, a phrase that encapsulated the entire tragedy. They cannot return. This wasn't an order, it was a statement of strategic reality. It confirmed that the decision was rooted not in casualty management, but in absolute, national self-interest. The lives of the soldiers were a lesser priority than the continuation of the shadow war and the preservation of the geopolitical lie. The perpetual lie. Despite these fragments, the map, the budget note, and the blacked-out memo, the world never learned the full truth. The public narrative remained unchallenged. Accidental loss during an unrelated humanitarian support flight. The lie was perpetuated because the cost of truth remained too high. Because to tell it would mean admitting the existence of a mission that violated treaties, borders, and every principle the government claimed to defend. It would expose the cold, utilitarian logic of a security apparatus that saw human beings as expendable assets to be used and discarded. The soldiers of Project Orion, the Sentinel team and all the others who vanished, fulfilled their final, agonizing mission even in their absence. Their sacrifice upheld the lie that preserved peace, or at least, preserved the illusion of peace. So the soldiers stayed where they died, in silence. The government never acknowledged their final transmission. In shadows. Their records were never reinstated, their names never cleared. In a war that wasn't supposed to exist, and that they were never allowed to come home from. They remain the permanent, unacknowledged ghosts of the Cold War, a testament to the chilling truth that sometimes, the greatest service a soldier can render is the ultimate act of self-erasure.